My boss fired me for being 3 minutes late to work. But what he didn't realize was that the very next morning, a phone call from corporate would completely change his career. The morning my boss fired me for being 3 minutes late started like any other normal workday, except for one small detail. The traffic light outside the office building stayed red just long enough for the clock on my dashboard to roll past 9 a.m. And by the time I walked through the office doors, the time on the wall monitor read 9:03, which in most workplaces would barely matter. But in my office, it apparently meant the end of my job. Before I go any further, let me ask something quickly, because I always find it interesting when people listen to stories like this online. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it in your country? Because when this whole situation first happened and I told a few friends, they couldn't believe a job could end over something so small. But unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. And my name is Ethan Walker. I'm 34 years old, and at the time, I worked as a project coordinator for a logistics company in Dallas, Texas. I had been with the company for almost 6 years, which in the logistics industry is considered a pretty long time, especially in a position like mine, where the job mostly involves coordinating shipments, managing schedules, and solving problems when deliveries go wrong. It wasn't glamorous work, but I was good at it, and more importantly, I was reliable. For years, my performance reviews had been consistently strong. I rarely missed deadlines, I handled complicated client schedules, and more than once, I had stayed late helping our team fix major shipping errors that could have cost the company thousands of dollars. My coworkers trusted me, and the regional manager, who occasionally visited our office, once described me as the kind of employee every department hopes to have. Unfortunately, my direct supervisor didn't see things the same way. About 8 months before I was fired, our department got a new operations manager named Victor Langford, and from the moment he arrived, the atmosphere in the office started changing. Victor was extremely strict about rules, especially time management, which might sound reasonable, except his version of time management felt more like military discipline than normal workplace expectations. He installed a digital clock system that tracked arrival times down to the minute and began sending warning emails to employees who arrived even slightly late, even if their work performance was otherwise excellent. At first, most of us assumed it was just a phase, something new managers often do when they want to establish. But over time, Victor's focus on small technical violations became almost obsessive. One coworker received a formal warning for returning from lunch 4 minutes late. Another employee was reprimanded for leaving 2 minutes early after staying an extra hour the previous evening. It didn't matter if the work was getting done. What mattered to Victor was control. Still, I managed to stay on his good side, mostly because I was rarely late. And when I was, it usually involved situations beyond my control, like traffic accidents or weather delays. Which brings us back to that morning. When I walked into the office at 9:03, Victor was already standing near the entrance with a clipboard in his hand. The moment he saw me, he glanced at the digital clock and shook his head like he had just caught someone committing a crime. I apologized immediately, explaining that a traffic signal had backed up the entire intersection and that I was only a few minutes behind schedule. But Victor didn't seem interested in explanations. He simply told me to follow him into his office. 5 minutes later, I was standing in front of his desk while he calmly explained that company policy required punctuality and that repeated tardiness could not be tolerated. I tried to point out something very simple. This was my first late arrival in months. But Victor interrupted me before I could finish. He said rules were rules and that if exceptions were made, the entire system would collapse. Then he slid a printed document across the desk. It was a termination notice. After 6 years with the company, my job had just ended over 3 minutes. What Victor didn't realize at that moment was that firing me that morning would trigger a chain of events he never expected. because the next day, someone much higher in the company hierarchy was going to start asking questions about exactly why I had been let go. And those questions would eventually lead to a conversation of Victor definitely wasn't prepared for. Walking out of the office that morning, carrying a small cardboard box with my personal belongings felt surreal. Because when you spend years working in the same place, you start to believe your position there is stable, even permanent in a way. But standing in the parking lot that day, I realized how quickly a job can disappear when the wrong person has authority over your employment. The first person I called was my wife, Amanda, who at first thought I was joking because she knew how consistent my work history had been. But when she realized I was serious, she asked the same question everyone else would eventually ask. Did they really fire you for being 3 minutes late? The honest answer was yes, but the story didn't end there. What Victor apparently didn't know when he terminated my employment was that my role in the company involved. As a project coordinator, I managed communication between multiple shipping clients, including one of the company's largest retail partners, a national electronics chain whose shipments pass through our regional warehouse almost every week. Over the years, I had built a direct working relationship with several managers at that company, which meant they usually contacted me personally whenever a problem occurred with their deliveries. Later that same afternoon, one of those managers, named Robert Jensen, called my office extension about a delayed shipment, and when he learned from a coworker that I had been fired earlier that day, he was apparently surprised enough to contact the regional office directly. I didn't know any of this at the time. As far as I was concerned, my job was gone, and I had already started updating my resume. But the next morning, something unusual happened. Around 10 a.m., I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman introduced herself as Sandra Mitchell from the company's regional corporate office. She asked if I had a few minutes to discuss my recent termination. That was the moment I realized the situation might not be as simple as it first appeared. Sandra explained that corporate had received questions from a major client regarding my sudden departure, and they were reviewing the circumstances surrounding the decision. She asked me to explain exactly what had happened the previous morning. I described the situation honestly, including the 3-minute delay, the traffic signal, and Victor's immediate decision to terminate my employment. There was a long pause after I finished speaking. Then Sandra asked another question. Had I received any prior warnings related to attendance? The answer was no. In fact, my record showed consistent punctuality for several years. Sandra thanked me for the information and said the company would review the situation internally. At that point, I assumed it was just a routine follow-up conversation. But what I didn't realize was that my termination had already created a problem much bigger than Victor's strict time policy. Because when corporate managers began reviewing department records, they discovered something unexpected. Several high-value client accounts had been relying specifically on my coordination work for years, and replacing that experience overnight was not going to be easy, which meant the decision to fire me for a 3-minute delay suddenly looked far less reasonable than Victor probably intended. And by the afternoon of that same day, the conversation inside the company had shifted from why I was late to why the department manager had decided losing a 6-year employee was worth enforcing a rule so aggressively. While I was at home the next afternoon, updating my resume and looking through job listings, the situation inside my former office was apparently becoming far more complicated than Victor expected, because once corporate began reviewing the details surrounding my termination, several issues started appearing that had nothing to do with being 3 minutes late. The first problem involved client communication records, which showed that I had been the primary coordinator for several ongoing shipping contracts, including the electronics retailer that had contacted the regional office earlier that morning. When corporate managers attempted to assign those responsibilities to other employees, they quickly discovered something Victor hadn't considered. Much of the scheduling knowledge for those accounts existed only in my personal coordination logs, which meant the department suddenly lacked important information needed to manage upcoming deliveries. The second problem involved performance reports. During the review, Sandra Mitchell and her team examined my employment history and found that my record contained years of positive evaluations, including several comments from senior managers praising my ability to resolve shipping delays and maintain strong relationships with clients. In other words, there was no documented pattern of attendance problems or disciplinary issues that would normally justify immediate termination. The more corporate looked at the situation, the more unusual the decision appeared. By late afternoon, Victor was called into a video conference with the regional office, where he was asked to explain why he had terminated a long-term employee without prior warnings or progressive discipline. From what a coworker later told me, that meeting did not go well. Victor apparently defended his decision by insisting that strict enforcement of punctuality rules was necessary to maintain workplace standards. But corporate managers pointed out that company policy actually recommended warnings and corrective discussions before termination, unless the violation was severe. Arriving 3 minutes late for a shift did not fall into that category. The conversation then moved to another topic: client relations. Corporate explained that the electronics retailer, responsible for a large percentage of our department's shipping volume, had specifically asked why the coordinator they had worked with for years was suddenly gone, and they were not happy with the explanation, because from the client's perspective, the company had just removed the employee most familiar with their operations over a minor timing issue. That was when Victor realized the decision he thought was a simple enforcement of rules had created a much larger operational problem. Later that evening, I received another call from Sandra Mitchell. This time, her tone sounded more direct than before. She explained that after reviewing the situation, corporate believed my termination had not followed appropriate management procedures, and they wanted to discuss the possibility of reinstating my position. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond because less than 24 hours earlier, I had been standing in the parking lot thinking my career with that company was finished. Now the same organization was asking if I would consider returning. Sandra also mentioned something else. Victor's management practices were currently under internal review due to multiple employee complaints about overly aggressive disciplinary actions. In other words, the situation that started with my 3-minute delay had opened a door to a much larger conversation about how the department was being run. And the person who had fired me so confidently the day before was now the one being asked to justify his decisions. By the end of that week, the situation had changed so dramatically that even I had trouble believing how quickly everything unfolded, because less than 48 hours after being fired for arriving 3 minutes late, I was sitting in a conference call with corporate management discussing my return to the company under completely different circumstances. Sandra Mitchell explained that after reviewing the department's operations and speaking with several employees, the regional office had decided to restructure management responsibilities for the logistics team, which in simple terms meant Victor Langford would no longer be supervising the department. Officially, the change was described as a reassignment to another internal role, but everyone involved understood what it really meant. Corporate had concluded that his leadership style was creating unnecessary disruptions. They offered to reinstate my position immediately with back pay for the time lost since my termination, and asked if I would be willing to resume managing the same client accounts I had coordinated before. I spent a long moment thinking about the offer because walking back into the same office after everything that happened wasn't something I had expected even 24 hours earlier. But ultimately, the decision was simple. I liked the work, I respected most of the people on the team, and the company itself had shown they were willing to correct a mistake when it became clear the decision had been unreasonable. So I accepted. The following Monday, I walked back into the same office where I had been fired just days earlier, except the atmosphere felt completely different. Coworkers greeted me with surprised smiles, and several people quietly told me they were glad the situation had been reviewed because many employees had been struggling with Victor's strict rule enforcement for months. A temporary supervisor from another department handled operations until a new manager was appointed, and the environment gradually returned to something much closer to the workplace I had known before. As for Victor, I only saw him once more while he was collecting personal items from his office. He nodded politely when we passed each other in the hallway, but neither of us said anything. There was nothing left to discuss. Looking back now, the whole situation still feels strange because the moment that seemed like the worst day of my career ended up revealing a much bigger issue inside the department. If corporate had never looked into the details of that termination, Victor's management style might have continued affecting employees and clients the same way for years. Instead, the entire problem surfaced because someone decided to enforce a rule without considering the consequences. These days, I still try to arrive early whenever possible, not because I'm afraid of being late, but because the experience reminded me how quickly small decisions by people in authority can affect someone else's livelihood. But it also taught me something equally important. Sometimes when something unfair happens, the story doesn't end at the moment things go wrong. Sometimes the next day brings a completely different outcome. And hearing this situation always makes people wonder the same thing. If your boss fired you over something as small as being 3 minutes late, would you fight the decision immediately, or would you walk away and wait to see if the truth eventually catches up with them?